All right, I think we've probably got a great number where we can give it a start. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Rose, a co-lead of the Fairfax County chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, along with Sarah Karish, who's also on this call. And we're just so excited today to introduce Dr. Joan Schiller, who's a member of our chapter and a recently retired oncologist here in Northern Virginia, to talk a bit about climate change and health. Just a quick note before we start, please feel free to send questions in the chat, and Joan will have time to address them at the end, but we will be keeping track of them as they come in, so you can send them as they occur to you. Do please take care to stay muted while Joan is speaking, and then later on, depending on how many of us are in the room, we might invite you to unmute. If you have any kind of logistical challenges or questions during the meantime, feel free to send them to me or to Sarah. And I think with that, Joan, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Rose. And I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on this webinar. As Rose said, my name is Joan Schiller, and I'm a physician here to talk to you about climate change and health. And thank you again for coming. I've been a medical oncologist, a cancer doctor for decades, and I've been pretty busy in my work. My jobs are listed here. They have included being deputy director of the Harold B. Simmons Cancer Center in Dallas, and most recently, a deputy director of the Inova Health System in Fairfax. My research interests have been on developing better and more effective drugs for lung cancer. So I've been busy. So busy, in fact, that I rarely took my head out of the sand to see what was happening around me. I rarely thought about climate change, even though one of my sons has worked in the climate change business for 10 years. And then a couple things happened. And these are two of them. My grandson, Bennett, who's 6, and my granddaughter, Dylan, who's a little princess, and she's 3. The next thing that happened, though, was related to a cabin we have in the mountains of Southwest Colorado. It's beautiful. The cabin's beautiful, the mountains are beautiful, the forests are beautiful. They're green, they're lush, or at least they used to be, until this happened. Due to the heat and drought, the spruce have become more vulnerable to the spruce beetle, which is devastating the forest, as you can see here. And while that dead wood, plus the heat and drought from climate change, have sparked forest fires all over the land. The Pine Gulch fire, the largest fire in Colorado's history, is about 100 miles from our cabin. And although it may have been Colorado's largest fire, it pales in comparison to the fires on the West Coast, where millions of acres have burned. So I became interested in climate change. And I figured out this is a complicated and confusing subject, even though the science of climate change, just like the science around cancer, is very clear. But it can be hard to point to one event and say, that's because of climate change, or that's the moment that caused cancer. It's indisputable when it happens, but sometimes it's confusing since we're not exactly sure how we got there. And then 2020 happened, and that changed even more things. It highlighted the effects of climate change like never before. And with so many events happening in one year, it's my hope the entire public takes this more seriously. Like this, something that happened in 2020, COVID-19, a virus that came out of a wet market in Wuhan, China. Now, we'll talk later about its relationship to climate change, but some of the consequences of this infection, overwhelmed medical resources, lack of PPE, lack of medical supplies, political upheaval. Well, as a health professional, this really hit home. One of the unexpected consequences from the COVID epidemic is that it cleared up the air in many cities around the world as traffic in them dropped to almost nothing. One of the many bad things about COVID-19 is that we're now going to be able to literally see the pollution returning. And of course, all these fires, particularly ones from the West Coast in California, have polluted our atmosphere and skies, our cities, and not just where they occur, but thousands of miles away. This photo was taken in Madison, Wisconsin, and you can see how hazy the sunset is. And so I started to think, what will Bennett and Dylan's life look like in 50 years? After all, they'll be in their mid-50s. Will there still be beautiful forests to look at? In fact, will there be any forests to look at? How many new diseases will there be? Will they be able to get medical care? And 10 years from now, when Bennett's 16 and we have autonomous vehicles, will Bennett even need a driver's license? And some good things may happen by then, like teleportation or the cure for cancer, settlement on Mars, world peace. But I do know one thing which will definitely happen, because it's already happening, and that's climate change. So what is climate change? Now, I know you guys all know this, but just to make sure we're all on the same wavelength, so to speak, usually much of the solar energy from the sun gets reflected back into space. However, we know that some of it gets reflected back into space as infrared radiation, but greenhouse gases such as methane, carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide trap infrared radiation and reflect some of it back to the Earth, thus warming the planet. And where are these greenhouse gases coming from? Well, some are natural, but more and more they're coming from burning of fossil fuels. Now, how scientists exactly measure this is a story for another day, but suffices to say that polls show that most Americans understand that climate change is happening, and a majority understand that we're causing it. And 97% of climate scientists agree that it's real, that it's caused by increased greenhouse gases, and that human activity is causing almost all of it. Think about it. If, God forbid, you were to be diagnosed with cancer, and 97% of the oncologists you went to all agreed on a particular treatment, would you really go with the other 3%? So why is it becoming a national priority now? Because for once, we can finally see it and experience it. We know this has been the worst year for fires on the West Coast in decades, possibly ever. This year, we have more named hurricanes than ever before. So many, in fact, that we ran out of names and had to use the Greek alphabet to name them. And then of course, air pollution. We can actually see before and after pictures of what major cities look like since motor vehicle transportation decreased. And so what are some of the consequences of climate change and global warming? Well, they include rising temperatures, more extreme weather, rising sea levels, and increasing carbon dioxide levels. These in turn cause severe heat, severe weather, air pollution, changes in vector ecology, increased allergies, effects on water and food supply and quality, and of course, effects on the environment. Well, that's a lot. And it's too much for us to all talk about today. So I'm going to focus on these 4, since I think that they are clearly most relevant to us in Maryland, Virginia, and the DC areas. These include heat-related illnesses, diseases due to air pollution, diseases due to changes in the vector ecology, and access to care. Now, all this, in turn, really does happen, and it really does cause an increase in temperature. Yeah, the Earth really has been warming. This is a composite of the Earth's temperature since the last ice age, 20,000 years ago. We're projected to go far, far above where humans have never been before. The reason things are increasing so much is because it's an unnatural increase in greenhouse gases through the burning of fossil fuels. In the past, global temperature changes have been due to world-changing events like the moving of continents, massive volcanoes, meteors, global ice ages. This is the first time that a species, humans, is added to that list. Yeah, it is getting warmer, particularly at the poles. And why is a warming Earth important? Well, as the Earth warms up, ice at the poles melt, resulting in rising sea levels. But from a health perspective, in extreme heat, Evaporation is slowed to the point where it cannot adequately cool off the body, which can lead to heat exhaustion or heat stroke. The hottest 10 years on record have all been since 2009, and 2019 was the second hottest. September of this year was reported to be the warmest September ever recorded. But it's also getting warmer right here. This is a graph showing how Washington's temperature has changed over time. The y-axis is the average number of days at or above 90 degrees. In 1916, Washington, D.C. had 30 days at or above 90 degrees per year. And look at where we are now. And in 2040, 20 years from now, there's projected to be 44 days at 90 degrees or above. Now, I don't know about you, but whenever I hear the words extreme heat, I think of heat stroke. However, there are more effects people probably don't think about, like premature births, for example, increasing aggression, and believe it or not, a decline in cognitive functioning. And the people most at risk? Children, the elderly, and pregnant women. And people who have to work outside without air conditioning, like in Qatar and Doha. In 2012 and 13, over 900 workers in Qatar died when living and working there, and close to 200 workers died building the 2022 World Cup Stadium in Doha. Baghdad hit 125 degrees recently. Do you know what 125 degrees feels like? A reporter in Baghdad recently said that when touching a doorknob, she got blisters on her hands. Now, deaths are certainly the most important consequences of heat, but they're not the only one. Our current power infrastructure was not designed to handle this heat. California has already seen massive rolling blackouts due to increased air conditioning use. Let's turn to pollution and the health effects of air pollution. One of the major pollutants associated with air pollution is particulate matter, or PM. PM 2.5 stands for particles less than 2.5 microns in diameter, and you can see just how small it is when compared to human hair. It comes from burning fossil fuels in factories, power plants, and motor vehicles. Climate change may affect exposure to particulate matter by increasing temperature and increasing emissions from fossil fuel-fired power plants due to demand for electricity for cooling. And particulate matter can have serious health impacts. Acute exposure can exacerbate illness in people who already have lung and heart problems and increases hospitalizations and deaths from cardiovascular and respiratory diseases and lung cancer. Long-term effects include an increased risk for respiratory diseases, again, such as COPD and pneumonia, heart disease, and lung cancer. Particulate matter has also been linked with increased allergic disease and asthma. So, air pollution is a major, major problem. It was rated fourth highest global mortality risk factor. It is responsible for over 4 million deaths worldwide each year, including over 88,000 deaths each year in the United States. Why would we do anything that increases any particulates in our air when we know this? But particulate matter doesn't just come from the burning of fossil fuels. It also comes from natural sources, like smoke from fires. I'm sure you remember the fires in Australia in 2019 and 20. 2019 and 20. 33 people were killed in incidents directly related to the fires. However, the haze from the fires affected about 80% of Australia's 25 million people. And Australia is a big country, as you can see, when compared to the United States. But it wasn't only the 33 people killed directly by the fires. Now, this is a complicated slide, but the graph shows PM 2.5 concentration on the y-axis, and the x-axis shows time. The green line is Australia's national air quality standard, and the red line is her historical average, well below the standard. The blue line, however, is Eastern Australia's actual PM 2.5 concentration. between October 1st, 2019 and February 10th, 2020. PM 2.5 concentrations exceeded the 95th percentile of historical mean values on 125 of 133 days. The authors estimated that smoke from the fires was responsible for 417 excess deaths, over 1,100 hospitalizations for cardiovascular problems, and over 2,000 hospitalizations for respiratory problems, and about 1,300 presentations to emergency departments for asthma. These deaths and hospitalization would not have been recognized as being attributable to the fires and smoke at the time they occurred. Let's move on to diseases caused by changes in vector ecology. Vectors are animals, usually insects such as mosquitoes, ticks, and flies, which can spread diseases. We're going to talk about some diseases caused by viruses, but I need to stress I'm only scratching the surface. I'm not an epidemiologist or animal scientist. So remember, climate change is an emerging, complicated field, as we have said. These insects are extending their range and are active longer into the season so that more people are being exposed for longer periods of time. For example, you can see the range of two types of mosquitoes that cause dengue fever, malaria, and Zika. The red on this map represents the areas most likely to be impacted by these insects. So if you like insects, you are in the right place and time because we're going to have more bugs. In fact, we already have more bugs. According to the CDC, illnesses from insect vectors have tripled in the United States from 2004 to 2016. Take malaria, for example. The red areas on this map are where malaria is predicted to be in 2060, and you can see where it'll be in the United States. A temperature increase of 2 to 3 degrees centigrade would increase the number of people at risk for being infected by malaria by 3 to 5%. Now that may not sound like much, but it's actually several hundred million people. The rates of malaria in the US are 5 times higher than they were in 1990. Dengue fever. It is transmitted by a mosquito and causes nausea and vomiting, rash, and aches and pains, including eye pain, which is typically behind the eye. It emerged as a worldwide problem in the 1950s. It was not a problem in the US until recently, where we had several outbreaks. A 1 degree increase in temperature in the average global temperature centigrade could increase the number of people at risk for dengue fever by close to 50%. Lyme disease, we've all known and heard about. It's the most common vector-borne disease in the United States, spread by deer ticks. With the increase in temperature and the longer breeding seasons, the range of the deer tick is spreading. And with that, we're seeing more cases in more places, as you can see on this map. With an increase in the annual temperature of 2 degrees centigrade, incidence of Lyme disease in the United States is estimated to increase about 20%. Now, All Things Considered on National Public Radio recently ran a story discussing whether medical residents needed more education on climate change and vector-spreading diseases. It included a part about how a medical resident almost missed making a diagnosis of West Nile virus. Before 2002, there were no such cases in Massachusetts. In 2018, there were 49. Now, 49 doesn't sound like a lot, but it used to be 0. We're already seeing that vector-bearing season is getting longer. In Richmond, Virginia, there are already 22 more mosquito days compared to 1989. So if you like mosquitoes, you're in the right place at the right time. We have more bugs. And as long as we're talking about irritating things, let's talk about pollen. As CO2 levels rise, pollen levels rise. They're expected to more than double by 2085, and the pollen season is longer. And we know that pollen is one of the biggest triggers of asthma. Another thing that's increasing as carbon dioxide levels go up are woody vines, like poison ivy, which is getting bigger and more toxic. I also want to talk about access to care, because it's one we don't usually think about, and yet it's likely to be a major consequence of climate change. We all know about the COVID epidemic. I'm going to use it as an example of what could, and probably will, happen in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the COVID-19 virus was totally unknown before 2019. Since then, it's been responsible for more than 1 million deaths worldwide, including over 210,000 in the United States. So even though we're not sure how directly related COVID-19 is to climate change, it serves as an excellent example of what can happen as we have more and more pandemics. Who can forget these headlines? Lack of protective equipment, shortage of ICU beds, not enough ventilators. And so what have we learned about COVID-19? One thing, that pandemics put a huge strain on medical resources. And we haven't even talked about medical personnel and first responders. And these medical personnel include not just doctors and nurses, but pharmacists, therapists, technicians, the people who work in hospital kitchens, janitors, and so forth. We're also learning that pandemics can disrupt something we take for granted, supply chains. Now, there's an old saying that lieutenants think strategy, but generals think logistics. I know, logistics is boring, but turns out to be vitally important. One example, the Second Punic War between Carthage and Rome. It turned out it was not really decided by the brilliant generalship of Hannibal, but by the ability of the Romans to keep supplies flowing into Rome, no matter how many battles Hannibal won. And in 2018, when Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico, it caused closure of a factory that was responsible for the bulk of IV bags for the United States. And the result was national shortages of IV fluids in many facilities. We've seen what disruption of our infrastructure can do to we've already seen what disruption of our infrastructure can do to our ability to get health care. Was there access to medical care in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina, a Category 5 hurricane, hit New Orleans? It caused a significant number of deaths. More than 700 bodies were recovered. An estimated 215 nursing home residents and hospitalized patients died, including those in Memorial Hospital, where 45 corpses were recovered. And at Charity Hospital, 200 patients were not evacuated until 5 days after the hurricane, and they had been without power during those 5 days. More intense and frequent storms, droughts, floods, fires, and pandemics will result in the increases in the frequency and severity of extreme weather events that can knock out power and phone lines, damage and destroy homes, roads, bridges, and affect chemical plants, oil refineries, and Superfund sites, all of which increase the risk of exposure to carcinogens. Data from the electronic medical record company Epic show that appointments for screenings for cancers of the cervix, colon, and breast were down between 86 and 94% in March 2020 compared to 2016 and through 2019. And when they modeled the effect of COVID-19 on cancer screening and treatment of breast and colon cancer over the next decade, they found, or their model showed, that almost 10,000 excess cancer deaths are possible. So another thing we've learned from COVID-19 is that climate changes can make serious diseases worse, like COVID-19. Now, this is a very wordy slide, but what it shows is a study looking at exposure to air pollution and COVID-19 mortality in about 98% of the US population. They found that a very small increase in long-term exposure to PM 2.5 is associated with a large increase in COVID-19 death rate, 15%. And who's going to be impacted the most by climate change? Well, not the high CO2 emitters. Those countries who contributed the least greenhouse gases will be the most impacted by climate change. The top picture here shows the countries that have high CO2 emissions in red, North America, Europe, and Australia. And the bottom shows the countries most vulnerable to climate change. And in the US, people of color are usually the hardest hit by climate disasters. And why is that? Because many minorities do not, well, one reason, and there's many, but one reason is that many minorities do not have the resources to live in clean, healthy places. 68% of African Americans live within 30 miles of a coal-fired power plant, compared to 56% of whites. And they are exposed to 38% higher levels of nitrogen oxide, outdoor pollution. Even though Americans constitute 13% of the US population, they contribute 23% less to climate change, and they may bear 21% more of the harms when compared to other racial groups. African Americans are twice as likely to die from dangerous heat compared to other groups, and Latinx Americans are 3 times more likely to die from asthma than any other racial or ethnic group in the United States. And the last thing I want to mention is on the political side. The CDC says that climate change will lead to mass migration and international conflict as environments become more and more unlivable. For example, the Syrian refugee crisis was caused by 5 million refugees leaving the country due to a war which was catalyzed by a severe drought. And needless to say, chaos and conflict are not good for healthcare. So we need to address climate change now, or we will be like them. If we're saying that it's a hoax and that climate change activists are alarmists, when the asteroid is almost on top of that, what did that result in? Dead dinosaurs. Even the Department of Defense has identified climate change as such an important threat. I'm going to just read part of it from a report to Congress in 2016. Climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. And these impacts are already occurring, and the scope, scale, and intensity of these impacts are projected to increase over time. We are not going to be able to solve this problem if we can't work together when we're politically and personally divisive on this issue. Climate change and climate action cannot be voted down party lines. I'm sure most of you remember this Bruce Willis movie where an asteroid is heading toward Earth, and NASA sends Bruce Willis and his mining buddies up to the comet to blast it to bits. Well, think about it. What if scientists told us today an asteroid was coming in 50 years, the size of the one that killed the dinosaurs? What would our society do? Remember, Bennett and Dylan will be in their 50s and will probably have grandchildren by then. So this is a real threat. I think we would be clamoring to find the technology to blast it to bits. What if they told us an asteroid was coming in 20 years when Bennett and Dylan are in their 30s and with kids? What would we do? I think that in addition to frantically finding the technology to blast it to bits, we'd also be clamoring to figure out how to mitigate the upcoming damage. What about 5 years? Now this is a problem. I think we would be working on ways for humanity to survive. I mean, will that involve colonizing Mars, setting up cities in underground caves or beneath the seas? And how would we select who gets saved? Actually, I think we are probably closer to this scenario, about 10 years away from Armageddon. We need to start working on it now. We know what the solution is. It's not science fiction. It's just a matter of implementation, but we need to start changing things now. Because make no mistake, this comment is going to hit us. The big question is, will it be a head-on collision or a glancing blow? Now, there is some good news. Fortunately, the costs of renewable energy have plummeted. This graph shows the cost of electricity on the y-axis over time on the x-axis. And look how much solar energy has gone down. Right now, today, wind and solar are the cheapest form of power generations, cheaper even than coal. Isn't that amazing? Even the coal companies believe it. The Kentucky Coal Mining Museum switched to solar power because it was cheaper in the long run. And more institutions, conservative institutions like the Pope and the Catholic Church, are recognizing that we are in a climate emergency. JP Morgan, one of the biggest banks in the world, wants to align with the Paris Climate Agreement. And the reason they do that is they want to be able to argue to clients that combating climate change opens the door to more capital from investors and reduces their risk of becoming outdated. Well, in the meantime, what can we do? What can we do to protect ourselves from the health effects of climate change? I wish I could just prescribe a few pills that would take care of the problem, and I know that's what everybody would like to hear. But alas, no. So, what can we do right now before it's too late? Well, on a personal level, reduce automobile transportation. It's the #1 source of household emissions. Reduce home heating and air conditioning. That's the #2 source. Reduce air travel. And talk it up. Help break the silence around climate change. To get more information what you can do, there's a variety of websites, and I think Sarah or Rose have put them up or will put them up on the website in the chat room. What can we do now? Support environmental organizations, and there are many of them. Two that I personally support are the Citizens Climate Lobby and the League of Conservation Voters. CCL, for example, is a grassroots organization dedicated to building political will for climate solutions at the federal level. What can we do now? Support environmental policies. For example, I just recently signed the Health Professionals Climate Action and Carbon Pricing Declaration. And I believe Sarah or Rose will put that website on the chat box as well for other medical professionals. Another example that CCL advocates is for legislation such as the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. This act will put a steadily rising fee on fossil fuels and distribute the money to households. But most importantly, what you can do, vote. Over 60% of our carbon footprint is baked into our economic infrastructure. Realistically, the biggest, most urgent thing you can do about mitigating the effects of climate change is taking national action now. I mean, after all, what do we have to lose? What if it is a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? I mean, is that so bad? Now, I would be remiss in not thanking the people who have provided so much help. Citizens Climate Lobby for making this possible. Sea Change Conversation for their support and use of some of their slides. My colleagues at OUCH, which is Oncologists for the Understanding of Climate Health, for their support during these trying times. And my son, Craig, he's the one who works in climate change, for educating me about climate change over the past 10 years and helping me with this presentation. I finally listened to him. And of course, thanks to you for your attention. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joan. There was a lot that you shared. I'll start off with one question that came to us while you were speaking, and please invite everyone else to add your questions in the chat. And, the first one is that there's a lot of eye-opening information that you shared. And so this person's curious about, given the diversity of the issues you've laid out as a physician, what concerns you most?
I'm trying to get my slide thing here to listen to me here. I'm sorry. Stop share? There we go. Okay. What concerns me the most? Boy, that's a tough one. They all do. All the ones I just mentioned are really going to have such a major impact on us. Pandemics, like COVID-19, my gosh, it showed how really, really vulnerable we are. Air pollution, we saw the fires, we see the coal burning power places. That's going to really, really, really affect us. I think the thing that worries me the most is literally, what are we going to do about it? Because we have to do something about it, and we have to do something now, or really, truly, our children and grandchildren are really going to be affected by this.
And you laid out a handful of suggestions for ways that people can begin to act as well. So thank you for that. Another kind of question in the chat here from Jimmy is about Indigenous communities, that they hold key knowledge and best practices for protecting natural systems and reducing environmental impact. But centuries of Western thought renders their voices virtually invisible. And so do you have ideas about what we can do right now to amplify the voices of Indigenous activists and to center their needs?
Yeah, boy, that's such an excellent point. One thing we can do is not build oil pipelines through their reservations, because that's been a huge issue. And again, speak to our congressmen, our senators, our politicians. I mean, it will impact them, but it will impact us as well.
And then that's really helpful, Joan. Thank you. And one other question we received is sort of what you think that medical professionals in all sorts of areas, what they might, how they might bring some of this information to their patients or bring it more closely into their work, whether for those who are still practicing or in various settings.
Yeah, well, I think one major thing they can do is talk to their hospitals and medical centers and make sure that those hospitals and medical centers are green, so to speak, and their patients. Because patients may not be realizing how much climate change will affect their health in the future.
Yeah, thank you. I see we've got a couple maybe coming in the chat. Certainly feel free to continue there, or you can use the raise hand feature if you'd like. We can make sure you're unmuted as well if it's easier to ask a question. So in the meantime, I have one for you, Joan. You highlighted 4 of the many kind of health impacts in that nice graphic. And I'm curious that if you had the opportunity to add in a 5th, which one would you have added to your presentation?
The rising sea level rises and the effects that it's having on our oceans. It's not only increasing the level of the sea, but it's doing bad things to the oceans. It's become a new environment in the oceans as well. So animals are dying in there. I mean, the oceans are increasing in acidity, they're increasing in temperature. The other major thing is as the polar ice melts, it melts and it raises the ocean levels, but it also stops reflecting solar energy away from the planet. So more solar energy is getting absorbed by the poles. So the effects on water and oceans, I think, is also going to be a really big deal.
And then just to take that one step further, can you talk a little bit about, as the ocean becomes less healthy, how that leads to health impacts for those of us on land?
Yeah, well, it will impact our ability to fish. I mean, as a lot of the plankton and those little plankton type creatures will go down. Our coral reefs are dying right now, and it's not sure how many are going to be left. It will depend upon how high the temperature rises. Things like that.
Sure, yeah. So we've got another really thoughtful question just sent to me. And the crux of it is, how can we get this out to the wider world? And this person noted that they watched a documentary on social media and realized that climate change is one of the widely used keywords on Google, but the results that people see are different based on their already existing beliefs. So for example, a person who's less likely to believe climate change is real is more likely to see sort of climate change is fake type of results, even when they're using the same keywords. So do you have any recommendations for sort of fighting that, our information echo chambers, and reaching people with information like this?
Well, that's a problem. It's clearly a problem. It is a problem that is changing, though. I mean, more and more people are, in fact, recognizing that climate change is happening. And more people are recognizing that it is due to humans. It's not natural. But I think what we just need to get the word out there. Presentations like this, voting for elected officials who agree that climate change is a major problem. It amazes me that with the politics going on now, climate change is barely mentioned. I'm just shocked by that.
And I
so
do certainly, sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, so that's where we need to get involved and get involved in organizations that are trying to get the role out there. CCL, as I said, or League of Conservation Voters, and there's so many more.
Yeah, yeah, and I recognize that our talk today is exactly in the direction that we want to be moving. Pearlie, I noticed you have your hand up. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, my daughter is a PhD entomologist who's the tick expert for the state of Delaware. I think she would add to Joan's comments just a couple things. One is that ticks transmit many diseases besides Lyme, and ticks are very resistant to heat, but not cold. So that's why they're moving into areas where they have not been before. And I am an economist who was an analyst at CIA for 31 years, worked a bit on environmental issues in the early 90s, enough to be convinced that climate change is a massive problem. And the reason the free market can't deal with it is because people who use fossil fuels are not paying the full cost. They're not paying the environmental costs associated with using the fuels. So any economist will tell you that the answer is a carbon tax of some kind, and people are very responsive to changes in the prices they pay. We saw that in the oil price increase of the 1970s. And of course, you'd want to phase it in gradually so there's not a shock. If you think overall taxes are too high, you can reduce other taxes to keep the total tax burden the same. That's by far the most effective way, the most efficient way of reducing carbon emissions. It may not be feasible in the US right now, but that's really what we should keep in mind.
Well, and that, yes, you're absolutely right. You know, CCL, Citizens Climate Lobby, is supporting a bill called the Innovation and Tax Dividend. I think I got it right.
Energy innovation and
energy innovation. Sorry, yeah. Do you want to mention it, Sarah? You could probably describe it better than I.
Sure, yeah. So for those who don't know, Citizens Climate Lobby has, for most of its existence, been promoting a policy called carbon fee and dividend, which would put a steadily rising fee, or you could call it a tax, on fossil fuels. and the revenue collected would be evenly distributed to households in the US. This policy is predicted to lower carbon emissions by 40% within 12 years. And the vast majority of people come out ahead or break even under it, because even though everyone's getting the same dividend, not everyone has the same carbon footprint. So their prices they're paying for things are going up. And that's what Joan described, that, you know, the impacts are not borne equally or not borne equitably, you know, by the people who are responsible for the emissions. So the legislation in Congress right now that embodies this policy is called the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and I think a link has been posted in the chat where you could learn more about that. And that bill has, I believe, 81 co-sponsors at this point. And of course, this congressional term is ending. It will need to be reintroduced in the next Congress. But Citizens Climate Lobby, as always, our volunteers are working hard to talk with their members of Congress and make sure that it gets reintroduced on a bipartisan basis. So if you go to the CCL website, you can learn more about how you, as a volunteer, could get involved.
And there's other types of bills that are proposed as well, right?
Yes.
Cap and trade and yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of carbon pricing bills actually in Congress, I think. Maybe the most there ever have been. So so it's not, you know, it's an idea that whose time has come. I guess we should put it that way.
Yeah, thank you. Let me jump to you, Pearlie, and then we've got a couple more questions in the chat as well.
Thank you very much. As many of you know, I'm an old guy. I've lived 91 years in this marvelous nation, and I've seen many crises. One of the things I want to comment to you, Doctor, is that you brought to mind a very important point, but I have to regress a little bit. And I think back into World War II, I was about 10 years old, but I was understanding what we had to do because of leadership. Then later on, as I grew, I spent some time in the military and so forth, and I saw leadership was important, but also technology. And the fact of the matter is that the American people are becoming more believing that as far as scientists are concerned, perhaps they should keep quiet and come up with wonderful technology. We're going to get an antivirus that's going to fight COVID-19, and so we won't have to worry about it. And you noted this because you said there is no pill. And the thing that we need to do is we've got a small group of about 40 people here that are talking about it, but what you need is 40,000. And how do you do that? So I think we have to express something that these people will understand and say, yeah, we have to do this. And Dan Rather, I think few of you remember Dan Rather, came up with what we need to get across to the populace. He said, there will not be an antivirus for climate change. There will not be an antivirus or, doctor, as you said, a pill for climate change. The technology that we have is that technology we need now. So I think we need to get across to the 40 million people that we need to get to is this saying, there will not be an antivirus for climate change. So that's my comment. Thank you, doctor, for recognizing that. And maybe you can get that across to the American Medical Association because they are somebody that gets the word out.
Yes,
Thank you
so
all.
that is one thing that we are trying to do, is in fact to try to mobilize the medical profession through medical societies more, because I think medical professionals are trusted messengers, for one thing. In regards to your comment about there will be no antivirals for climate change, you are so right. We're probably not going to be able to go back to where we were, 150 years ago in terms of the climate. But what we have to do now is mitigate it and try to reduce the effects as much as we possibly can now, because it's only going to get worse in the future, the longer we wait.
So true. And, Joan, just to kind of build on Pearlie, your comment, and then Joan, your point about medical professionals as trusted messengers. In the chat, Stephen wrote that when he went to school to be a health professional, he was disappointed in how conservative and closed-minded some classmates were. What's the best way to connect health to climate without sounding, in quotes, liberal?
Yeah. I think one way is going to be through the medical societies. If we can get them to endorse climate change, I think that their members will listen. One thing that all health professionals can do, and many organizations have done, is to sign that letter, which I think you put on the chat, the website for that. Organizations, medical organizations, I believe, have signed it, as well as individuals.
Oops, sorry about that. Excellent. And we've got another question here from Meredith, that premature births in Australia after the fires spiked. And is there any evidence of that here in the United States?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. Good question. I'm sure we will be finding out, though, because people are studying the health effects of those fires as we speak.
Oops, great. And then Craig, I've noticed you've got your hand raised. You want to unmute?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Dr. Schiller, excellent presentation. That was really good. And I just wanted to respond to the recent question from Stephen. So I have, as my mother stated, I've worked in the climate change space for think tank Rocky Mountain Institute for the last better part of a decade, and that issue of the messenger and the words is key. And I want to highlight that with a couple of facts. One is that about 67%, so 2/3 of Americans now believe in climate change and that it's a real issue. So why is it that at a political, at a corporate and a political level, there's so much standstill? It is because disproportionately, not proportionally, disproportionately, leadership is challenged with climate change. And that means that climate change and getting action isn't about the technological solution or making these things known. It's a psychological issue. It's about convincing the right people and their constituents who that they're acting in best interest for. So I say all that because one of the things that we've had to work a lot about is the right message to the right people. And I would say a couple, takeaways is actually the word climate change alone can be very triggering. And so depending on who you're talking to, I don't even use those words. I think in the presentation, there were a few slides that talked about, medical studies that talked about premature deaths or increases of asthma rates because of particulates. Those did not have climate change in there at all. And I think an educated person, even a conservative, very conservative one, I'm assuming like a medical classmate or a conservative doctor, that is evidence-based. It has nothing to do with climate change. There's a rational conclusion that the more pollution or the hotter temperatures, increase, this will be a larger issue, but don't use the word climate change. And similarly, I think there's per audience, there's other words you can use to excite. A popular one now at the election is jobs, right? And yes, we have to acknowledge that in the energy transition, there will be some job losers like coal and natural gas, but that will be over a long period of time in which there'll be many job winners. So I think a message that's exciting would be, hey, let's turn the Rust Belt into the battery belt. and prepare America for making all these electric batteries that are going to be around the world in 30 years, and make sure we're producing those and becoming a leader in the future. That is me saying things about jobs and our economic security in a space that is really directly related to climate change, but I'm totally ignoring the electric vehicle and the climate change side of that. So to me, it's just knowing the trigger words and knowing what not to use. I think what the health issue is so related is you could give that same presentation without the word climate change, and you'd have similar conclusions, but it makes it personal and relatable that we can all easily understand. Thanks.
It looks like we've got maybe time for one more. And I see, Pearlie, you have your hand raised, or perhaps it's left over. I'm not sure. Would you like to add anything?
I think I took my hand down, but I do want to say that the last presentation is very correct, because we have to bring to the 40 million people that it is something that you and your children are going to have to face. So I like what was said, and I do agree. And that's why I like sort of Dan Rather's thing too, because we're not talking strictly about climate change. We're talking about climate change and pandemics together. And everybody understands this pandemic now. I think many of them don't understand how to combat it, but that's all right. Thank you for another time. Right.
Yeah, thank you. It's, we're closing in on the hour, so I just want to yet again thank Dr. Joan Schiller for sharing with us today, and for all of you for coming. As we know, this is step one, I guess, of the many steps we have to bringing more awareness and political will to these issues. So just want to reiterate that if you would like to join any of the Fairfax County Citizens Climate Lobby chapter meetings, we would love to have you. We can drop the link in the chat just before we go. And also, if you'd like to just learn more about Citizens Climate Lobby in general, there'll be a link to informational sessions. And so with that, I think, there we go. There's the Fairfax County meeting invite. And in one moment, I'll have, whoops, the informational session. Thank you. Great. So with that, we will wrap, and thank you yet again, Joan.
Thank you very much. Very, very good presentation. Interesting.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Joan. And thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you all very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Very good presentation.
Thank you.